Hi, I'm Ben Stiller, and you're listening to the Pantheon Network.
Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 6, Episode 27 of Music is Not a Genre, MxG. I'm going to tell you this right now. My intros are always louder than almost everything else I do, which kind of messes up the editing, but that's my problem because, this is a two-person operation. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening. Listeners, please go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre to see a video for every single episode of this podcast. Watchers, hello out there. I will explain some of the things you're seeing. And yes, if you go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre, it gives you links to anywhere you can listen to or watch this podcast. Easiest way to do it. And quick note, as always, as we are doing this fundraiser to ride out this Season 6, which will hopefully not be the last season, please consider supporting Season 7. I really, really need your support. I will put links to Patreon and to a fundraiser right below wherever it is you're watching or listening. So please, even if it's $1, that makes a big difference, because imagine if all of you gave $1. Let's get right to it then. This is the topic for the week. Almost forgot my words there. We are in my What's an Album and Why series, and it's part 5.1, 90s diversity or whatever. And yes, that's the title. That is the title and the subtitle. So we're into the 90s, and even though it's part 5.1, this is actually the sixth part of the series because I did part 4.1 and 2 for the 80s, catching you up here. And I will be doing 2 parts for the 90s because, again, I know a lot about the 90s, and the 90s were kind of big in many ways, which you will see in the second half next week, especially. So why do I say 90s diversity or whatever? Well, there's a book, those of you who are just listening, behind my right shoulder called The 90s, a Book by Chuck Klosterman, which anybody who's interested in the 90s, whether you lived through it or not, I highly recommend this book. It's such a great retrospective on that decade. It really places it in history contextually in so many ways, just describes what went on and hopefully disabuses people of some of the thinking they have around what did happen in that decade and what the significance of the decade was. And it's not just about music, by the way. It's about politics and every single thing. There is a chapter on music, I believe. But the 90s were a weird mix of significant changes in and out of the music industry and a general sense of kind of underplaying or pretending not to care or thinking, well, of course, this is progress. We're out of the 80s now. It's a foregone conclusion. Things are going to get better. We all thought the future had arrived and would just keep getting better. And, of course, the 2000s came, et cetera, et cetera. That'll be in, part 6 or whatever of this series, but the lack of caring and attention would eventually be its undoing, of course, but also you never know what's coming, and that was part of it. And as far as what was going on in the music industry, I'll say this. Yes, the 90s were more diverse on every level than any decade before it, but not nearly as diverse as the decades that would come, which is what you hope. I don't think that the music industry has been as diverse as it is now, and that, of course, is partly because of the internet. It's partly because of demographic changes. It's partly because of the ease of recording, giving everybody, almost everybody, an opportunity to release their music, regardless of how much money you have, which pulls in a lot of people. Immigrants and minorities and people who, traditionally speaking, don't have as much money as the white folks. So a lot of that, and that's what makes the 90s so interesting, is that it was still pretty expensive to record things in the 90s. So there was a bit of a wall up against people below a certain socioeconomic level, and yet somehow there was a tremendous amount of diversity that just kept ballooning as the 90s went on. And I think that is part of the theme of this episode, but it's also to do the usual, what I do in all of my What's an Album and Why episodes, which is year by year rundown, including some general notes for the year, top albums, the ones that hit number one in that year, notable debuts, and other notable releases. And then, of course, at the end, I'm going up through, I'm not going to tell you what year I'm stopping for this episode. You'll have to tune in and stay tuned. Then I'll do conclusions after whatever that final year is on the first half of the decade. And I'll save some of those conclusions for part 5.2 next week. A little bit about how albums changed, etc. My featured song, as always, some questions for you, and a mention of the bonus MxG video, the bonus episode, which is at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. The bonus MxG video for this episode is on women in 1990s music. And that's just to point out one aspect of the kind of diversity that the 90s was growing. Again, not as diverse as now, but you will see what kind of impact women in 90s music made. And that's not just rock. That's going to be every major genre that I could research in the time and resources given. I'm going to mention in that bonus MxG video on patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. If you are a supporter of women in music, you should go there and watch that, and there'll be a link below for that. My sources for this episode are the usual: Wikipedia, digitaldreamdoor.com, radiox.co.uk, Paste Magazine, You Discover Music. Some disclaimers, of course. I'm going to miss a lot. It would be impossible to mention all of the notable anything in any year. I will be biased, especially because I did live through the decade, and there are certain ones that just hit my, mind in a certain way because of memories I had or preferences I have. But I will, as always, try to include as much as possible from any corner of the notable music universe in each year of the 90s. And let's get to it. Let's go year by year. That was my intro. Starting with, can anybody guess what year I'm starting with here in my albums of the 90s in the first episode? If you guess 1990, well, no, actually, you're right. Sorry, I don't know who hit that buzzer. 1990, of course, starting at the beginning of the decade. Although, depending on you math geeks out there, right? The year 2000 was actually the last year of the 20th century. That's how the 20th century gets its name. So 2001 was actually the first year of the 21st century. And so technically, does that mean 1990 is no, it doesn't. That doesn't hold exactly. 1990 is the first year of the 90s. It's a pretty uneventful slide from the old decade. Most music in the 90s was still echoing the 80s. Not much of it was looking forward. It was funky in kind of a boiled over 80s way, though that was slightly looking forward to more new jack and changes in hip hop and things like that. Some stuff we associate with the 80s was actually released this year, and I think even in 91 and 92, there were a couple of songs and albums in particular where I was like, oh my God, I forgot that came out in the 90s. I thought it was an 80s thing. That's how 80s it sound. It was a weird year, 90, but relatively cohesive, actually, with a few notable debuts. Not as big a list of debuts or as significant a list of debuts as in subsequent years in the 90s, but pretty decent, I would say. So some top albums, the ones that hit number one. And I'm going to mention a little bit more about albums that hit number one, not just later on in this episode, but towards the end, I believe, of the second episode, if I'm remembering my notes correctly, just having to do with the number of albums that hit number one in a given year and the statistics and the availability of them online in general. So, Phil Collins, But Seriously, was a number one album in 1990. Milli Vanilli's album was number one in 1990. Bonnie Raitt, also number one in 1990. All of those albums came out in 1989, but grew and eventually charted and made number one in 1990, which still doesn't beat Paula Abdul's Forever Your Girl, which came out in 88, but was still knocking the charts in 1990. It was a number one at some point in the year. Sinead O'Connor, Do Not Want What I Haven't Got, was number 1. New Kids on the Block, number 1. I believe that was their debut. Vanilla Ice had a number 1 album in 1990. So not just that Ice Ice Baby song, the entire album went to number 1. That was when a single could drive the sales of an album. That was the case for a lot of the history of music, not so much now. And the winners, so there are 2 really, because two different sources said what was the top album for the year, the most sales for the year. MC Hammer, okay. So yeah, kind of boiled over 1980s. But also Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation from 1989. Those 2, depending on your source, saying that that's the absolute top album of the year. Some debuts. Green Day, first album. I think was it 39 Smooth or something like that? It was not the one you're thinking. It was not Dookie. Alice in Chains, first album in 1990, Mother Love Bone. You're seeing a theme here that will come bigger as we move on. For those of you watching, I'm wearing a T-shirt, and that T-shirt is, again, They Might Be Giants. You've seen it before. That's partly because the best albums, or at least I'll say some of the best albums from They Might Be Giants were in the 1990s. It's also because the flannel shirt that I was going to wear is just too hot in here. I didn't feel like doing it, which is kind of a 90s attitude, right? Whatever. So Primus, debut album in 1990, Ween from New Hope, Pennsylvania, Superchunk, Ride. So you see shoegaze starting to make an appearance. Not that was the first shoegaze ever, but it grows. The Charlatans, or the Charlatans UK as we know them now. The Laws, who did the song There She Goes Again. Their album, and was it their only album? I don't know. Better Than Ezra, 1990 debut. Dread Zeppelin. If you don't remember them, that's probably okay. The Breeders, not the one that was the famous one with Cannonball and all, but still pretty freaking great. Babes in Toyland, Annie DeFranco. The Sundays, Mazzy Star. Wilson Phillips had a debut album in 1990. Teenage Fan Club, Biohazard, The Jesus Lizard, which was featured, their name was featured in the King's X episode last week. Blues Traveler, Black Crowes, Alan Jackson, Dixie Chicks, now known as The Chicks, Kid Rock, 1990, Ice Cube, after he left NWA, Digital Underground, the Humpty Hump people, A Tribe Called Quest, 1990. What an amazing year for debuts. Belle Biv DeVoe, Poison, and Vogue. Mariah Carey's debut album was 1990. CNC Music Factory, everybody dance now. D-Light, Groove is in the Heart. Enigma, debut, if you remember, that kind of ambient, set to a dance speed, and it was like choir and stuff. It was pretty cool. Something that hadn't quite existed in that way before. Brand New Heavies, one of my favorite funky bands from the 90s, debuted in 90. Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, some ska from Boston. Cherry Poppin' Daddies, that whole retro thing, which is always around, but it really started to build as far as swing music in the 90s. Bella Fleck and the Flecktones, first album in 1990. So other notable releases in 1990. They Might Be Giants, Hello shirt I'm wearing, Flood. It's probably still my favorite album of theirs, although Lincoln and their debut, some close second and third. Their major label debut was Flood. A lot of great hits on there. Depeche Mode's Violator. Public Enemy, Fear of a Black Planet. Sonic Youth's Goo. Jane's Addiction's Ritual de la Habitual. INXS's X. So even though INXS is thought of as an 80s band, they had quite a few hits in the 90s. In the early 90s at least. This one, INXS's X, featured Suicide Blonde and Bitter Tears. So pretty big hits. And then Fugazi, released a significant album in 1990. 1991, we are at still, I would say, a bit stale overall. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the changeover from the 80s to the 90s and the way that I talked about the changeover from the 70s to the 80s and how that was, to me, and still is, the most rapid changeover in music. I'm going to explain that a little bit more in, I think, the second episode. I don't know. Just watch them both. Listen to them both. Anyway, so 91, still a bit stale. Not as quick a changeover as we like to remember to the 90s, but we're starting to see more future trends, more stars, future stars, I mean. It was much more crunchy than 90. 90 was more funky. This one's a little crunchier. I remember in 91 and in 90 feeling pretty tired of music trends at the time. And, feeling like I needed a refresher. I had listened to, I always listen to contemporary music, and I had been listening to it then, but I was also listening to a lot of classic rock and older music, just kind of catching up on things I hadn't listened to before, which is great. Everybody should do it, but it often indicates you're a little tired of what's going on or you're losing interest. It's a lot to me like the early 1960s, which was no offense to the very early 1960s, pretty stale for music. It retreated a bit from the rock and roll of the 50s, and it was kind of treacly pop and everything. Though I'll say this, many more notable debuts happened in 91 than in 90, which is crazy because there were a ton of notable debuts in 1990. I don't even know. So what a decade, right? Top albums for the year of 1991. Holdover, Vanilla Ice. His album was still number one at some point in that year. Paula Abdul's second album, number one. So she was on a trend there, on a roll. Michael Jackson's Dangerous. REM had a number one album. I think that was Automatic for the People, was it? Oh, man, or was it Out of Time? I always mix those two up. U2 Achtung Baby had a number one album. Van Halen, or Van Hagar, I'll say. Metallica, the Black Album, which is somewhere in here. In fact, I just put it away. Those of you who are just listening, behind me are my CD cases. Usually you see them in the background as old custom speakers, custom with the K. And I have them turned around to look like speakers because they used to be my dad's speakers on his gigs way back in the 70s. But I have turned them back around because I have modified them to be CD cases, which you can see on my website, nickdimatteo.com. I have pictures of them and everything. And the reason why I turned them around for these two episodes is because the majority of CDs that I own and kept, at least, are from the 1990s, so it seemed appropriate to me. Guns N' Roses had a number one album in 1991. So that's, again, like older rock bands hitting big. Metallica, Van Halen, U2, Guns N' Roses. Even REM was a little older by then. Skid Row had a number one album. Natalie Cole's Standards album. Michael Bolton. And then tops for the year are the 1-2 punch. Again, it's kind of a 1-2 punch. Garth Brooks' huge breakout third album, Rope in the Wind, and Mariah Carey's eponymous debut, which of course came out in 1990, but didn't hit big for almost a year, and it reached number one in 1991. So Garth Brooks and Mariah Carey in 91 kind of duking it out. I don't think they fought in real life, but I could be wrong. Look it up. Debuts for the year. A lot of country, a lot of well-known, or soon-to-be well-known country artists debuted in 1991, including Keith Urban, Brooks and Dunn, Mark Cohn, who I consider country-ish, Trisha Yearwood. Alanis Morissette had a debut album. It's not the one we think of. She was still pretty pop back then. Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch. Ricky Martin's debut album, Jodeci, Seal, Color Me Bad, I Want to Sex You Up, Boys to Men, another bad creation, ABC. Yeah. Sounds of Blackness, Cypress Hill, Tupac, Scarface, PM Dawn, all 91. Massive Attack, LFO, Orbital, EMF, who did Unbelievable, Blur, The Magnetic Fields, John Spencer Blues Explosion, maybe. I could for some reason, I was listening in 2 different years. Live, the band Live, Crash Test Dummies, Spin Doctors, Two Princes, Smashing Pumpkin, debut album was 91. Jawbox, Hole, Pearl Jam, Temple of the Dog, which was their only album, but worth mentioning. The Wiggles, the Australian kids band, their first album was 91, which is crazy because my kids watched the Wiggles a bit, and that was much later than that. Some other notable releases in 91, Matthew Sweet's Girlfriend, his breakout album, and just an incredible album. Still probably my second favorite album of his. Mudhoney, Uncle Tupelo, Sting's Soul Cages, Tom Petty, Into the Great Wide Open, Fugazi's second album. So that one I mentioned before, I guess, was their debut. Who knew? I didn't know, and I did the research. Soundgarden's Bad Motorfinger, Teenage Fan Clubs, Bandwagon-esque, A Tribe Called Quest, The Low End Theory, De La Soul is Dead, Chili Peppers' Blood Sugar Sex Magic, Pixies' Trompe Le Monde, Dinosaur Jr. and Primal Scream and Gangstar all had great albums in 91. My Bloody Valentine's Loveless, a classic. Prince's Diamonds and Pearls, still killing it. Really, Prince remained on the charts till about 94 and then came back a little bit in the early 2000s. Nirvana's Nevermind, 1991. I'm going to talk a little bit about grunge in the conclusions. I won't do it now, but you will hear me mention, of course, a lot of grunge in these next few years, including what I just mentioned, which brings us to 1992, the year both country and grunge exploded. So very white. And beyond that, of course, but most of the people who made famous in country and grunge white at the time. Though some other music did pop up. Definitely not the 80s anymore in 92. It's eclectic in a very 90s way. Lots of women and R&B and hip-hop as seen mostly by the debuts and more notable albums by established stars. So the top albums for the year, Michael Jackson, Criss Cross had a #1 album. Ice Cube, The Bodyguard soundtrack, Whitney Houston, of course. Wayne's World soundtrack, that's where the resurgence of Bohemian Rhapsody. Def Leppard, Black Crowes, Michael Bolton. Garth Brooks had 2 #1s of the year. That Rope in the Wind I mentioned in 91 and The Chase, which Rope in the Wind was the top album of the year. But close behind that was Billy Ray Cyrus's Some Gave All, on which there was Achy Breaky Heart. Who knew that Billy Ray Cyrus would launch, the juggernaut of his daughter? Some debuts for 92. No, I'm not trying as hard. Well, you know what? That note doesn't apply anymore. I'm not trying as hard because 90s, whatever. Dre's The Chronic, Redman, Das Effects, Arrested Development, not the series. Look it up. Insane Clown Posse, House of Pain, Rage Against the Machine, Sublime, Four Non-Blondes, Blind Melon, Sugar, Bob Mould from Husker Du's band Sugar, Cracker, Rusted Root, Tori Amos had a debut, PJ Harvey, Juliana Hatfield, Lisa Loeb, so many great women, The Prodigy, Catherine Wheel, not a woman, CeCe Peniston, woman, Morphine, Bare Naked Ladies, Ace of Base, The Verve Pipe, John Cicada, John Michael Montgomery, Moby. No, and I remember hearing about Moby a few years before 92, but this was his debut album. No Doubt, Medeski Martin and Wood, and many other, there were many other jazzy things like in 1991, but more so in 92. That kind of resurgence of small ensemble jazz happened a lot, along with that resurgence of swing music. TLC, Dada. I'm going to Disneyland, I believe. Pavement, Martina McBride, Winona Judd, Right Said Fred, The Wallflowers, of course, Jacob Dylan's band, Bob Dylan's son, and Mary J. Blige, all debuts in 92. Notable releases, other ones, REM, Automatic for the People, so the other one must have been out of time. Thank you, my notes. Alice in Chains' Dirt, Clapton Unplugged, The Beastie Boys' Check Your Head, Pantera, Ministry, all great albums in 92. Stone Temple Pilots' Core, Dream Theater, and Aphex Twin had great albums. K.D. Lang's Ingenue, Annie Lennox's Diva, Prince's Love Symbol, The Cure's Wish, Lemonheads' It's a Shame About Ray, personal favorite. Stereo MC's Connected, wanted to like it more. Bone Machine by Tom Waits, Morrissey's Your Arsenal, Gin Blossom's New Miserable Experience, Madonna's Erotica, Grave Dancer's Union Soul Asylum album. Megadeth, Screaming Trees, and L7 all had great albums in 92. Peter Gabriel's Us. Fish had a good album. 10,000 Maniacs, Our Time in Eden. Elton John's The One. Apollo 18 by They Might Be Giants is considered one of their classics as well. And Ecstasy's None Such, which brings us to 1993. It's a really fractured and disparate year, kind of like those mid-1970s years, although not as fractured as it would get in the decade here. And this decade, I think, is more fractured than the 70s in some ways, but not as fractured as the world would get later on. 16 number one albums. Music was going everywhere with no clear big direction, despite what we remember about 93, which was good for diversity. Lots of huge artists debut this year in almost every category. So top albums in 93, another Garth Brooks, Clapton Unplugged, Aerosmith, Meatloaf, Billy Joel's River of Dreams, his last album, proper. Nirvana's In Utero, Pearl Jam Versus, U2's Zooropa, Depeche Mode's Songs of Faith and Devotion, Jackson's Janet, Mariah Carey again, Streisand Back to Broadway, Cypress Hill, Snoop Dogg's Doggy Style, the debut, by the way, Sleepless in Seattle soundtrack, and the winner of the year soundtrack to The Bodyguard, Whitney Houston, which came out the year before. Debuts, wait a minute, that was debuts. I don't know what's going on here. Are these other, holy crap. I'm sorry. Those were the top albums. I need to read ahead. Somebody just told me about reading ahead. I think it was my son. Debuts, so many big ones. These aren't the big ones. Snow, Informa, and R. Kelly. So it's basically two criminals. Mark Anthony's debut, Shaggy, RuPaul, debut album in 93. Tony Braxton, Jamiroquai, Suede, Counting Crows, Sheryl Crow. So there's two crows if you're counting crows. Bikini Kill, Liz Phair. She put other things out prior to that, but her first proper album was 93. Beth Orton, Amy Mann, Belly, Letters to Cleo, Cranberries, Dar Williams, Bjork's solo debut, not really. It was her adult solo debut, her actual debut as a solo artist, not the Sugar Cubes, which was a wonderful band in the 80s and early 90s, was in 1977 when she was a child. Just learned that. Look up Bjork's 1977 album. Archers of Loaf, featured in the episode on Weird Names. Built to Spill, David Gray, Beck, Radiohead, The Verve, 311, Collective Soul, Candlebox, Everclear, and tons of super metal and hardcore music like Rancid and Tool from all over the world, but mostly by forgotten artists. Tons of hard hip-hop, though contrastingly, many of these artists are still revered, like the Wu-Tang Clan, Onyx, Fat Joe, Mobb Deep, KRS-One, and other hip-hop like The Coup, The Roots, Diggable Planets, not hardcore, these were. Quite a lot of jazz, too, but no one super well-known except Diana Krall's debut was in 93. Decent amount of country from people like Nickel Creek, Shania Twain, Faith Hill, Tim McGraw, Toby Keith, may he rest in peace. Stand-up debuts from Martin Lawrence, Dennis Leary, Adam Sandler, and Jeff Foxworthy. So stand-up albums were still a thing at the time. Other notable releases: New Order's Republic, Morphine, Cure for Pain, Jellyfish Spilt Milk, De La Soul, Tribe Called Quest, Kate Bush, Stereolab, Fugazi, all of those great albums of that year. Mazzy Star, on which had Fade Into You. Matthew Sweet's Altered Beast, often considered his best, though I don't agree. Yo La Tengo, Breeder's Last Splash, on which there was Cannonball. PJ Harvey's Rid of Me. Pumpkins, Siamese Dream. Queen Latifah, Primus's Pork Soda. Jodeci, Tony, Ice Cube. Points to anybody who can tell me the spellings of each Tony in Tony, because I couldn't. James is Laid, Sting, 10 Summoner's Tales, Flaming Lips, Phil Collins, Both Sides, Sarah McLachlan, Fumbling Towards Ecstasy, Kravitz's Are You Gonna Go My Way? That's Lenny Kravitz. Afghan Wigs, Gentlemen, Melissa Etheridge had a great album. Blur, Modern Life is Rubbish, Salt and Pepper, Very Necessary, which had Shoop, and What a Man. Hey, so I was going to do the usual and just list all of the links that I'd love for you to check out, but I realized that everything you need to know and everywhere you need to go is at nickdimatteo.com. That really is the hub. I list all the links in every episode just in case, but nickdimatteo.com is where I put everything that I do. If you want to know more about this podcast, whether it's the audio version or the YouTube version at youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre or wherever else the podcast shows up, or if you want to support the podcast at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre, just go to nickdimatteo.com. It's all there. If you want to check out my full discography of original music and covers for my band REC, REC, and beyond, it's at nickdimatteo.com, including all the streaming and social links for wherever you listen to music and wherever you check out your soch. My acting clips are there. My voiceover clips are there. Graphic design, my blog, and most especially, it's the best place to contact me. If you go to nickdimatteo.com/contact or just hit the contact is on every single page. You can send me a note, say hello, ask me any questions you'd like. You get a newsletter a few times a month, and If you have a project of your own and need work done for it, whether it's audio editing or music or voiceover or graphic design, or if you have an event and you need live music, go to nickdimatteo.com, contact me, say hello, let me know what you need. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Let's get back to the show. So before we get to 1994, those of you who are just listening, you're not going to really notice much of a change. Those of you who are watching might have noticed a slight cut in the video, and that's because I kind of psyched myself out. This is a little bit of BTS, no, not the band, the behind the scenes about what's going on here, and that is when I divide an episode into 2 episodes because of length, my brain goes, I need to finish it in the first half. And anyway, long story short, I was skipping over a bunch of things, which I now don't need to skip over and can use, which is, more for you then. So let's get to 1994. Even more fractured than 93. 23 number 1 albums. Same as in 1974. And I don't think that's a coincidence. There are a lot of parallels to those decades. And, those of you who lived through the 90s and remember a lot of what happened in the 90s was an echo of the 70s in so many ways. And that includes this. It was a real fractured middle of the decade, more so than the 80s, than the 60s and all of that. Although, again, not as fractured as it would be in I think the 2010s is when it got super, super fractured. And you're going to have to wait until one of the final episodes of this album series for that. Still not anywhere near the most number 1s, exactly. Again, the diversity is striking on all levels. A bizarre and huge year for debuts, just all over the place, as though the industry or culture needed to take a step back from the hard press forward. Lots of quiet and or retro music happening in 94. Post-rock and MOR making appearances in the middle of the road, whatever you want to say. So that's an indication the industry was throwing everything at the wall, whatever would stick. Again, people needed to kind of step back from the hardness of what was going on. At the same time, this is known as the peak year for grunge and alt-rock music. So again, what we remember is not always true. And you can see why, though, that both can be true at the same time, that the charts and notable releases will show that grunge was still a huge presence. Of course it was. It hadn't died yet. And we'll talk about grunge's death later on in this series. The top albums for the year: Mariah Carey, Toni Braxton, Snoop, Beasties, Ill Communication, my favorite of theirs, Boyz II Men 2, Alice in Chains' Jar of Flies, Soundgarden's Super Unknown, Pearl Jam's Vitalogy, Pantera, Eagles' live album. I forget the name of that album and tour because I'm not a big fan. Pink Floyd's Division Bell, The Crow, soundtrack to The Crow. If you remember that, there was a death on that. Brandon Lee. Lion King soundtrack. Murder Was the Case soundtrack. That was Snoop and Friends. John Michael Montgomery had a number 1 album. Tim McGraw had a number 1 album. Kenny G's Holiday album was number 1. And Ace, the top albums of the year kind of tied again. I don't know why this is the case. That Lion King soundtrack I mentioned, but it was tied with Ace of Base's The Sign. That's that Swedish band. I saw the sign and it opened up my eyes. I actually love that stuff. So that was the number 1 album of the year. Some notable debuts in 1994. Aaliyah, Brandy, Usher. That's how long Usher's been around. All for One, Blackstreet, Fugees in 94, yes. It's not their big album. Nas, Notorious B.I.G., Biggie, Warren G., Coolio, Method Man, Outkast. So we're talking, again, just a bunch of hip-hop, just legends debuted in 94. Big Bad Voodoo Daddy, so more of the retro. Though I had no idea Cherry Poppin' Daddies was so ahead of the curve. A, because I didn't listen to them, and B, because I assumed all that retro stuff started in the mid-90s or whenever, that Jon Favreau movie, Swingers. Was it Swingers? It came out. Bowling for Soup, Seven Mary 3, The Cardigans, Sister Hazel, Sixpence None the Richer, G Love and Special Sauce, Ben Harper, Jeff Buckley, Long may he rest in peace. Elliott Smith as well. So 2 people who died tragically. Paula Cole, Dave Matthews Band, Mountain Goats. I didn't know they'd been around that long. Hootie and the Blowfish, which keep this in mind for next week's part 2 of the 90s. Kenny Chesney, Old 97s, Oasis first album in 94, Sunny Day Real Estate, so some true emo. Jimmy Eat World, some kind of second wave emo. Weezer, Marilyn Manson, Cuse, Toadies, the Toadies, Bush, Low, Korn, so some harder stuff. Corner Shop, one of my favorites from Britain. Luscious Jackson, With My Naked Eye, and that CD somewhere on these shelves. Veruca Salt, Cake, Portishead, The Sea and Cake, Tortoise. So a lot of crazy notable debuts. Other notable albums from this year. Beck's Mellow Gold, Loser was the breakout, so it's the second album. Nine Inch Nails' Downward Spiral. Green Day's Dookie, I think it's also their second album. Live's Throwing Copper, second album. Pavement's Crooked Rain. Nirvana MTV Unplugged. Holes Live Through This. Cranberries No Need to Argue, on which they had the song Zombie. Tori Amos Under the Pink. Neil Young had been putting out great albums in the 90s after kind of a slump in the 80s, including his 94 album Sleeps with Angels. Crosby, Stills, Nash put out what many people say is their last great album in 1994. Probably underrated. I don't know. I haven't heard it. Stones' Voodoo Lounge. Reba McEntire was killing it. Johnny Cash's American Recordings, his first with Rick Rubin. Elvis Costello still on a roll from the late 80s with Brutal Youth in 94. Madonna's Bedtime Stories. The last of her run before she had that comeback. Liz Phair's Whip Smart, which I love. Critics trash so much that Liz Phair does. I don't trash anything she does. No FX's Punk in Drublick. Love that. Primal Scream's Give Out But Don't Give Up. The Prodigy, Music for the Jilted Generation. Stone Roses' The Second Coming. Blur's Park Life, which has the song Girls and Boys. Jeanne. And the album was called Pronounced Jeanne. Mary J. Blige, My Life. TLC, Crazy Sexy Cool. The Roots, Do You Want More? God, one of my favorite bands and albums. Massive Attack's Protection. Aphex Twin, Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. Which brings me to conclusions for this episode. Yes, we are already at conclusions. I love packed episodes. I could have put all of the 90s in one episode, but I would have had to rush even more than I usually do, which, by the way, I listen to podcasts on 1.2 because I find that most people talk too slowly and also just like to get through them. I know someone who listens to them on 2.0. That's a little too fast for me because I like to enjoy the humanity of it, and 1.2 is kind of a good compromise. Even 1.5 is too fast for me. I try to talk as though you were already listening in 1.2. That is my goal. I want you to be engaged, and I want to get to everything that I have to say and not make it too long of an episode, which is, of course, happened here. And that's why I'm saving 1995 to 1999 for the second episode, which is next week. But some more conclusions. While the 70s and 80s ranks as the quickest changeover, I talked about that in the previous episode on this series, the 90s are a close second. They creeped in 91, and they kicked in fully in 92. And I will talk about why those were both the case in the next episode, and how the change from the 90s to the 2000s was even more reminiscent of the 70s to the 80s. So I would say this was a semi-quick changeover, kind of like the 60s to the 70s. Again, another parallel to the 70s, where the 70s didn't really fully kick in to me until like 72-ish. 71 maybe. Same thing with 91 and 92. In many ways, and if you read this book, Chuck Klosterman's The 90s, a book, the 90s was a pivot decade because it was the last throes of the pre-internet age. And it was the first of the internet age. It's the first to indicate where the future was going. So it was like kind of existing in two worlds at the time, which in its own way was kind of cool. This book can explain it better than I can. The number of albums released was exploding. It had hovered a few thousand above or below 20,000 for a good 25 years. So let's say from 65, well, no, I guess 25 years. So like in the late 60s, since 1970, in that area through the mid 90s. But by the mid 90s, I could be wrong about that, and I explain why in the second episode about the dearth of certain statistics online, or at least I couldn't find them. By the mid-90s, the number of albums released per year was inching towards 40,000, which is a lot more than 20,000. And of course, would be much bigger than that in subsequent decades. But this was the first year where there was a huge explosion. Let's go over some of those numbers, actually. In 1955, the estimate is about 5,000 albums were released. In 65, about 17,000 albums were released. Again, I don't know how true or not this is. It's the closest I can get to statistics. 1975, maybe 19,000, and 85, maybe 22,000. So you have 65, 75, and 85 all hovering around that 20,000, as I mentioned. But then in 95, it went up to about 37,000 and stayed there till about 05. Or not till about 05, but in 05, it was just under 40,000. So it was like a new high, a new average was in that 40,000 mark. So doubling basically the old average. But then by 2015, there were about 60,000 albums released. And again, partly because of the internet. So things are, and I don't even know how many albums have been released in these recent years. If you know that, tell me. We're going to see how this ballooning of albums affected the charts in 95 and the rest of the decade in next week's episode. I'm going to save other conclusions for part 2. But I will say this about the first half of the 90s, and that is we tend to think of it as hard, and it was. We tend to think of the 1960s as rock, and it was. But in both cases, the lived experience and the numbers and the charts and all of that show something different. As I mentioned in my episode on 60s albums, the best-selling albums through most of the decade were not rock albums. The first number one rock album was like 67 if you count the Monkees, and 68 if you want to, or if you don't want to count them. But I guess I kind of count them. Kind of crazy to think that. Same with most of the albums in the 1990s. Though to a lesser extent, there was more rock in the 90s, actually. The 90s were actually more like the 70s in range and mix, and in tone and in exploration. And even in how things were produced, the 80s were very trebly, and the 90s went back to being more mid-range, though much bigger bottom in the 90s than in the 70s. In the wild middle years, they had tons of number one albums, both in the 1990s and in the 1970s. In thinking the direction things are going, but then not knowing, and then things pivoting quite a bit in the decade. Both decades did that. So there were a lot of parallels between the 1990s and the 1970s. And what's funny is this: when I lived through the 90s, a lot of people, pulling up fashion and music and other things from the 70s and the 60s, but especially the 70s, and thinking to myself, will this decade be remembered for that, or is it overblown? And honestly, when I did the research, I found that the parallels went well beyond fashion, well beyond, just people mining certain kinds of music for the 70s. So kind of interesting. Now, the bonus episode is on women in 1990s music. Women were ruling every genre in one way or another in the 1990s, like never before. They had, of course, been in music for decades and are ruling more now than they ever have. And, whether you think of the hip-hop artists or Taylor Swift or whoever else. But really, you have Madonna and all of that. And of course, you had Diana Ross before and all the jazz singers and all that before that. But the 90s was saturated with just amazing female artists. And I don't know if it was because the industry thought, oh, well, there is a market. And so let's keep releasing more of them, or they felt like there was a trend happening. And so more and more and more. All I can say is the bonus MXtra video at patreon.com/music is not a genre is on women in 90s music in the following categories: Riot Girl, indie rock, Lilith Fair, singer-songwriter, country, pop, jazz, a little bit, R&B, and hip-hop. Kind of starting with the best and ending with the best, in a way you could say. That's what this bonus MXtra episode is about. So please go to patreon.com/music is not a genre and check that out. Which brings me to the featured song. The 90s was when I started my official releases. My official, I had recorded before then, but my official releases came out in the 90s. In fact, when you get to the second episode, you'll hear about one of those. So this is from that release. So this is technically not early 90s, but I did write this song in the early 90s. I recorded it 3 times. And the third one is the one that stuck for me. And this third one was from actually 1996 from a release called Your EP, which I reissued, remastered on a release called 96/95, 96/95. Look it up. It is streaming everywhere. This song is called Zuzu's Petals. And I chose it partly because I haven't featured it before, but also because I'm making the point, as I did early in the conclusions, that not everything in the 90s was grunge or hard or hardcore. There was a ton of it, but not everything was. So I'm sharing this track, which was from a grunge, kind of post-grunge EP, that Your EP from 96. But this song itself is quite quiet. It's quite intimate. Zuzu's Petals, if you don't know that reference, is from It's a Wonderful Life. It's something that Jimmy Stewart said of his daughter. He wakes up from the dream of not having existed, and when he does, the petals from his daughter Zuzu's flowers are back in his pocket. Zuzu's Petals. There was a band called Zuzu's Petals way back. I want to say they were, I don't remember where they were from, but I didn't name it after the band. I named it because I always loved that movie. Some of the lyrics in there, and it's about a woman or a loved one really who is lost and trying to find themselves and is having trouble looking inward and whatever. So 90s, whatever. So the Pat Conroy, the author, in one of his books, talked about babies being buried under a tree and how the person who buried them, I guess it was miscarriages or something, or babies dying of an illness, planted flowers, roses, I believe it might have been, and they grew. And so one of I think in the third verse of Zuzu's Petals, I put in the phrase, roses bloom from the hearts of angels. But then I say buried deep inside your mind, because it was about retrieving things within that were trapped. And again, this is the third version. There was kind of an electro version, electro pop. Then there was a kind of straight up power pop version, and then this intimate acoustic version, which I think you're really going to like. Some questions for you. What are your favorite albums from the first half of the 1990s? Do you remember the 90s the way I just described them, or do you have a different memory of them? Do you remember the diversity? Do you remember how it was alternately or equally hard and soft? Do you remember how the things that people talk about in the 90s as defining the 90s weren't always the things that rose to the charts or were released? I'd love to know your answers to all these, because as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for hanging with me for this season 6, episode 27, part 1 on 90s albums. Stay tuned next week for part 2.
Told you I want you now, this way and always. Such a vision to behold, almost like a baby in a way. When I hold you close, as if to say don't go, of Zuzu's petals. I know how you must be scared. I will do all I can do. Take away what you don't want there. But I don't wanna lose with Zuzu's petals. Yeah, it's gonna be alright. I know 'cause I was on the moon last night. It's okay to let your little girl take flight, as long as she remembers where her petals are. Roses bloom from the hearts of angels, buried deep inside your mind. Should we reach our hands inside it, where it's so wet, and see what we can find? We can run away if you're not afraid to be alone, and simply hope the little girl that's grown. She's watching, yeah. Will we find the peace and things we should have known? Will we find the home? Zuzu's petals, yeah, yeah. Zuzu.